The purpose of civilization is to reduce violence. This is civilization's job, as Confucius used to put it. If we accept this view, Libertarians are the most civilized people on the planet. We are at the forefront of the fight, not only to minimize violence, but to make its initiation illegal. All other social movements have some place for violence. They exercise it in the name of social justice, national defense, the interest of the state, the glory of God and religion, and so on. They institutionalize violence, they make it banal, we ban it. Popper states the obvious. Common sense tells us that civilization cannot flourish in an environment of generalized fighting. We spontaneously contrast civilization with war and savagery. And the way our pre-libertarian civilization curbs violence is to limit it to the actions of a state. In that sense, to be civilized today is to have a state. Primitives, or First Nations as we now call them, have language, arts, technology, culture. But they never reach the highest stage of civilization. Why? They have no state. Pierre Clastres saw in this condition a defining characteristic. A primitive society is a stateless one. For centuries, therefore, the question was not whether to have a state. Rejecting the state was to revert to the status of primitives, but to distinguish between the bullies who claimed they were forming one. What characteristics made their enterprise legitimate? What was the institution we had a moral duty to obey? The winning theory, the paradigm that we still live with today, was famously first formulated by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, as Ed Stringham reminded us yesterday. Tired of a war of all against all, as is assumed among primitives, individuals in a given society decide to hand over to one of them, the sovereign, the exclusive function of adjudicating all conflicts among them. Everyone agrees to abide by whatever decision the sovereign makes, provided that its purpose is to establish or restore peace between the parties. Well, no more wars and savagery within society. Discussion and argumentation replace brute force, and final decision does not come from the bully with the biggest stake, but from the duly appointed sovereign's judgment. Even if, occasionally, that judgment may be misguided, the overall damage will be less than the constant violence. The lawfulness of Hobbes' solution is not that it achieves order in society. A bully could do it too by brutally repressing dissidents. But that order results from the consent of the government. The sovereign's legitimate authority does not come from anointment by divinity, or from tradition, or from another source outside society, but from the covenant made between the members of society themselves. Libertarians too often forget that there is a good Hobbes alongside a very bad Hobbes. Two aspects are central to Hobbes' demonstration of the sovereign's legitimate power. First, that any number of individuals can enter into a covenant to appoint a lawful sovereign. So effectively, we in this room could create a legitimate state, albeit so small that it would offer little protection against other states. And second, whoever prefers not to join the covenant may not be forced into it. That is the good Hobbes. If these two conditions are not met, the sovereign cannot claim its power is founded in the consent of the government, and therefore that it is legitimate. Passionate controversies about the legitimacy of the state raged among political philosophers and the social elite from the publication of the Leviathan all through the Enlightenment and into the early 19th century. Jeremy Bentham squelched the discussion when he ridiculed the Hobbes-Locke-Rousseau idea of a state of nature, from which we would have emerged by a social contract. The season of fiction is over, Bentham declared. A state is a bunch of people in charge of a country, and that is that. After J.S. Mill, the question of the lawfulness of the state drops altogether from the agenda, except for a few anarchists and libertarians, notably Rothbard in the 20th century, nobody could conceive a civilized society without the state. Ayn Rand could not. Nozick imagined a protection agency and promptly turns it into a minimal state. Even in places where a state still existed, like in Africa, nobody seriously considered allowing the situation to continue. Principled libertarians today are putting the question of the lawfulness of the state back onto the table. I mentioned the word paradigm because the process I described is totally in keeping with a pattern identified by Thomas Kuhn in his seminal book of 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. I think you're all familiar with Kuhn's narrative of how the scientific paradigm is established and then loses its dominant position. Kuhn believed that truly dominant theories exist only in hard sciences. Indeed, when the paradigm shift is complete, you can no longer teach at schools and universities and no longer publish, for instance, that miasma causes the flu or that ether carries light. But a professor in lit.crit may choose to adopt a 19th century theory of poetics or a postmodern one. An economist may be a Marxist, Keynesian, or Austrian, and they will remain respected members of their academic communities. When it comes to the matter of the state, however, the implied consequences of teaching libertarianism are a lot direct. You are effectively telling academics who generally live on state salaries and grants that they are recipients of stolen money. You are not making friends here. Your listeners are more likely to conclude that you are mad rather than admitting that they are exploiters of the people. The mission of scientists and intellectuals, however, is to constantly question the prejudices and received evidence of their time. Isn't that the moment to start testing scientifically the validity of a state paradigm? Science is not descriptive. It does not tell us what things are, but what laws govern their movements in space and their evolution through time. If A, then B. If certain parameters are set, then predictable results will obtain. Science is normative. So let's examine the norms that govern our societies and assess whether the state achieves the predicted result of peace and security. Is it verifiable that if you establish a state, the level of violence will abate? We cannot run an experiment of recreating two societies, identical to, say, France or Poland, and remove the state from one of these and observe whether the people in the other society organize themselves in such a way that that society becomes more secure, more gentle, and therefore more civilized than the other with the state. But experimentation is not the only way to falsify a statement. You can also consider whether the statement contains logical inconsistencies that disqualify it a priori. And you can further look whether the empirical evidence lends at least some plausibility to the claim made. The state paradigm, I suggest, fails on both counts. The flaws in the theory of the state read like this. First, the consent of the government is pure fiction. Few people have formally approved the constitution they live under. Paradoxically, the newer the state, the more legitimate it appears, as most individuals living in, say, Eastern Europe today, have had a chance to vote for a new constitution 18-odd years ago. But not all approved it, and no opportunity has been offered again, even to people who were too young to vote at the time. The 220-year-old US Constitution is thrust upon living Americans, whilst most other peoples who are regarded as highly civilized never voted for their constitution, and the British even dispensed with one altogether. The fallacy that if you take advantage of what society offers, you implicitly accept its rule, is a morally repugnant and untenable argument. It is one Stefan Blanquers, where I was attacking yesterday. Driving on Hitler's Autobahnen and eating food produced in kolkhozes did not make you a National Socialist or a Bolshevik. The acid test here is to go to the authorities and declare you waive your right to social benefits and other state services, and consequently, you demand to no longer be subjected to the payment of taxes. Guess what? You will be told that taxes are not a payment for services rendered. They are extracted from you because you are a subject of the state. Tough. The argument actually debases Philip Robbitt's market state concept that has been so enthusiastically endorsed by the likes of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. The point is a serious one. If consent to the state and to the way it operates has not been given formally, violence is necessarily very high, by definition. Human beings are forced to perform certain actions that they explicitly condemn. The very existence of the tax police, of border controls, of censorship, labor laws, and other instruments of coercion is evidence that not everyone is consenting to the measures taken against them, even by a democratic government. This institutionalized violence victimizes at least a very substantial minority, if not the majority itself. Max Weber saw it clearly when he gave us his canonical definition of a state as the monopoly of legal violence over a given territory. New definitions of state attempt to be less blunt. Gabriel Inenarity, the rising star among leftist philosophers, and whose work is well worth studying, by the way, gives us a more positive definition. The main purpose of the state is the production and distribution of collective goods that are necessary for the functions of society. If you decrypt the smooth language, the meaning is simply how to organize large-scale robbery. The second flaw in the theory of the state is the conflict of interest at the core of its operation. The state arrogates a monopoly to adjudicate all conflicts in society, including conflicts involving itself and other members of society. If you have a conflict with the state, the case will be heard and the judgment will be rendered by the state itself, and this judgment will be binding and final. Can you imagine a grosser breach of any principles of justice? I know this is being corrected by certain more civilized, i.e. less violent countries, by having an appeals court over the state jurisdiction, such as various human rights international commissions. It is a precedent, but it is resisted by many of the strongest bullies on the planet, notably the United States. I shall come back to this controversial point in a moment. And finally, as any vulgar monopolist would do, the state sets itself the price it charges for the services it renders, however badly rendered, or simply unwanted these services may be. When there is a monopoly in society, state officials appoint regulators to make sure the monopolist does not abuse the situation. But no outside regulator decides how much state bureaucrats are allowed to levy in the form of taxes, social security contributions, and other compulsory payments. If one objects that voters act as regulators and then change the government now and then, this is like arguing that if more than half the regulators are on the take from the public utility they regulate, then that's the practice. As public choice theory tells us, this is how democratic state operates. So much for the theory. What about the empirical evidence then? It is overwhelming. Of all possible human organizations one can think of as a provider of security, it seems the state is the least qualified. According to R.J. Runnell and his research on democide, states have killed 262 million individuals in the last century, and this is not including torture, unlawful imprisonments, and deportation. And the present century is not yet 8 years old, that another 2 million innocents have died in the hands of state police and armies. How come, given the theoretical flaws and the small empirical evidence, how come the state paradigm maintains its quasi-universal legitimacy? The point I'm now going to make is controversial. Its merit is that it is true. I argue that it is because states kill that they appear to be legitimate. A cause does not become sacred unless and until men and women die for it. It is the blood of martyrs that confer to the cause its semblance of legitimacy, its authority, its power over us. Once blood is spilled, more blood is called for. Killing and dying, and offering all your individual property become sacred duties. To abandon the cause would be to admit that all those martyrs' deaths have been in vain. Think of how many street names, statues in public squares, paintings in museums, characters in literature and stories in our media, textbooks in our schools recount the deeds of glorious generals and humble heroes, freedom fighters and revolutionaries, and also victims of oppressors, of colonizers, and of persecutors. For in our modern world, victimhood has become a badge of honor. They died for the state, we are told. They gave it their money and energy. And the state is the heritage they bequeathed us. How can we turn our back on it? The Battle of Britain, Katyn, Pearl Harbor, Auschwitz, these are the real and solid foundations states are built on. It is the burden of history that it is so difficult to shrug off without guilt and apprehension. The state, the great confiscator of energy and property, has gone so far as to identify itself with the people it has killed. So far that you cannot now exist as a people if you do not have a state, as the struggles for so-called independence remind us every day. In one of his flashes of genius, Nietzsche recognized the imposture. Coldly, the state tells lies, and this lie crawls out of his mouth. I, the state, am the people. As if this consideration was not enough to discourage you from advocating libertarianism, there is another subconscious reason why people reject our discourse on freedom. To be subjected to power is to participate in power. If you obey, by definition, you are not alone. The master is at your side. And if he is your master, then he is necessarily greater than you are. And he is capable of caring for you if you serve him well. Calling God, the nation, the state. You know that you are not worth much. But let him invite you to join his posse. And together, you will be a force. People's attachment to the state is of a religious nature. It is rooted in their subconscious. It is part of the worldview they have been given at birth. And so far, they have had little incentive to take the trouble and sometimes the risk of emancipating themselves. There are very few libertarians today, for the same reason that there were very few atheists in the 17th century, and very few socialists in the 19th century. A philosophy of pure liberty goes against the grain of our society. You have nothing to gain by professing it. No money, no medal, no glamour, not even dates. Except, of course, that you are right. But as Voltaire used to put, it's dangerous to be right when the authorities are wrong. So yes, there are very few of us libertarians. Why do I say that it does not matter? If your question is, how do I rationally refute deep-seated convictions that have not been formed rationally? The answer is you can't. You do not refute an ideology. It becomes obsolete. In their own good time, without libertarians having much to do with it, the scales will fall from people's eyes. They will become aware of what Hannah Arendt calls the rape of reality by ideology. People will perceive that the ideology they have been taught no longer gives account of the reality of experience. Facts are stubborn, and one day it dawns on men and women that reality is more real than what their authorities tell them. This is when the paradigm starts to shift. It is a painful moment. People have trust in their state. Members of their family died for it. And they themselves endured sacrifices. They subjected themselves to state laws, however inept and penalizing these were. They gave up vacations, private school for their children, better housing, better medical care, in order to dutifully pay taxes that they could have cheated on. They were civic and obedient. because they believed the state was benevolent and was acting ultimately for their own good. And now, they have to accept that all these deprivations were in vain, that they were as naive as the devotees not only of a loony cult, but a criminal one. It is not an easy admission to make. The fascists and communists in Europe, the Afrikaners in South Africa, among many others, had to undergo that process. I don't think you ever heal entirely from experience. You merely hope the next generation will outgrow it. What is this new reality that makes the state paradigm obsolete? Karl Marx got this point right. It is technology and the conditions of production that dictate political structures. And the technologies that facilitated the growth of a bureaucratic nation-state starting in the late 18th century, these technologies have now reached their full development. They are undermining the very political structures they fostered in the first place. That's the internal Hegelian contradiction. For instance, telegraph and railways cast a tight network over entire countries and maintain populations under constant control. That control got even tighter when telephone and telexes were introduced. And of course, highways that allowed the rapid deployment of troops and police anywhere in the territory. But these technologies transcend borders. As Martin van Crevel remarks, unlike its pre-industrial predecessors, much of modern technology can operate only and to the extent that it is grouped into systems. A plow, a hammer, a musket can do its job even in the absence of another of its kind. But a telegraph, a telephone, an internet terminal have no value if they are alone, and their value increases in as a function of the number of other connected users. In theory, of course, each state was free to exercise its sovereignty. It could decide that driving would be on the left, when most other countries would have it on the right. It could build its own network or license private entrepreneurs to do it, ignoring its neighbors' networks and refusing to integrate with them. It made sense in the logic of states, whose principal function was to fight other states. A broad-gauge railway constructed by Imperial Russia and by Spain provided some protection against invasion, but it acted as a barrier to trade with other countries. Autonomy verges on the absurd when it comes to electricity grids, highway systems, telephone and computer networks that would have no connection with other countries. When states integrate networks internationally, however, two developments happen, pretty benign to start with, but pregnant with huge consequences. First, governments start losing control over this subject, who create new communities across borders, and these communities develop a legitimacy of their own, independent of any state. Multinational corporations, NGOs, new religious groups. And second, states themselves have to join international bodies that regulate standards and the use of technology, causing each state's autonomy to be further reduced. There are now thousands of such committees which determine independently from any state the standards of our most important technology. States are no longer the producers of norms, and they are no longer the sole producers of legislation, as we have to assert this legislation in the face of universal norms of human rights. A judgment rendered by the highest judicial authority in one country may be brought to a non-state higher authority, like the International Criminal Court in The Hague or the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And finally, states themselves undermine their own authority when they readily acknowledge there is very little they can do by themselves to tackle such planetary issues as economic cycles, pandemics, pollution, or terrorism. A national state is now but one of many players in a transnational field, together with international agencies, multinational corporations, NGOs, and other mafias. It is no longer what politics is about that matters, because it's basically all the same. It is how politics is done, the niceness appearance and charisma of politicians are the main issues nowadays in an electoral campaign. Politics has become an integral part of the entertainment industry. Except, of course, that the money politicians steal is real money, the blood they spill is real blood. If it is entertainment, it is at the moral level of gladiators' fights. And finally, the last straw that discredits politicians is their obsession with minor details of everyday life. Of course, it is the only domain where they can still legislate, the global issue being no longer under their control. The heirs of these states that people have died for, the heirs of Bismarck, Napoleon, Gladstone, Cavour, are reduced to legislate on whether patrons of restaurants may smoke, how much taxicabs you may charge, and what color you may paint your shutters. Josie yesterday gave us other revealing examples. People are slowly coming to the realization, however, that this is how little politicians can do for them, and that maybe the bureaucratic and fiscal imposition on the country is becoming excessive. If I am correct, and the paradigm is starting to shift, the question so often asked is, how do we go from here to there? Where is the Northwest Passage that will bring us to the other ocean, the one so aptly called Pacific? I started this talk with Hobbes because the issue he raises is a valid one. Societies need institutions to adjudicate conflicts, and the more legitimacy these institutions enjoy, the less of the violence they will need. Their decisions will be accepted as final and incontestable. But how do you achieve legitimacy? Hobbes' solution, as we have seen, was to place the source of lawfulness in a contract, a covenant, between the individual themselves, and it is their consent to the functioning of an institution that creates this institution's legitimacy. Company shareholders, club members, actors in a theatre, and orchestra musicians sign a contract that indeed confers legitimacy to their respective institutions and to the authority these institutions will exercise on them. But Hobbes hasn't solved my problem, has he? In the absence of a formal signature, opposed by each and all individuals living under a state, the consent he imagines that would give lawfulness to the state remains exactly that, a figment of his imagination, a fiction. The source of legitimate power that he postulates remains outside society. Ultimately, it lies embedded in the irrational philosophy that claims that violence is okay. There is another way, however, of conferring legitimacy to an institution, not by its source, but by its output, not by who founded it, but by what it does. As consumers, we perform this process of legitimization every day. We do not care much whether a business is a limited company or a partnership, whether its founders are Chinese, Jews, or French, whether it is state-owned or private. We deal with it not because of its ownership, but because of its output. We recognize it as a legitimate entity by giving it our patronage. My guess is that we will see more and more transnational organizations developing, possibly established by states, but achieving an ever greater autonomy as they can play one of their state founders against another, and an ever greater legitimacy simply by doing well the job they were set up for. I mentioned the International Criminal Court. I could add the European Central Bank, Interpol, and several others. I am not suggesting that these institutions constitute the ultimate libertarian ideal. Unlike the EU, however, they do not carry the genes of a super-government. Their remit is narrow and focused. As spin-offs of the state, their existence is no longer sacralized by history, and they remain legitimate only as they remain efficient. Non-state entities do not generate the same blind, irrational loyalty as state ones do. The very reasons why conservatives in the UK cling on to the pound sterling, their nostalgia for an emblem of Imperial Britannia when she ruled the waves, is the very reason why the Libertarians should encourage them to adopt the unemotional euro. Interpol is less likely to fight to the bitter end for the French government than the French police is. If Interpol captures a terrorist or a saboteur French farmer, it is less likely to release him for political reasons, as is now so often the case, lest other Interpol member states object. Michael Balzer, another philosopher of our parish, identifies the essence of liberalism in what he calls the art of separation. Each separation opens up a new space for freedom. The separation of the public and private spheres was the root of civil liberties. The separation of civil society and state made the economy at least partially autonomous. The separation of church and state placed morality in the private sphere where it belongs. These historical separations are not complete, of course, and in many societies the process has hardly begun. But it is irreversible. We are now witnessing the state itself breaking up and willy-nilly, devolving more and more of its traditional functions to multinational autonomous agencies. Is it not a welcome sign? So this is what is at stake. We are fighting once again for reason and enlightenment. The new obscurists look at real problems: war, terrorism, epidemics in Africa, the environment in Eastern Europe, all calamities created by state violence, and these obscurists conclude that the solution is more state violence. They believe we are great only because we are kneeling before them. Libertarianism is